and a very good evening to everybody. My name's Andy Schofield. I'm Vice-Chancellor of Lancaster University. It's great to be here to host this. This is a hybrid event, which means that those of you in the room are not the only people attending tonight's public lecture. We are joined, hopefully, if the technical aspects of this have worked, we are also joined and broadcast online. But I have to say it is an absolute pleasure to see real physical three-dimensional people as well as the two-dimensional people we've all been used to. And those of you that have made it into the room are welcome here to the Health Innovation Campus and to the High One building. But I do welcome all of you joining online too. Tonight is the second of this year's public lectures, but it is the first one we've done in this hybrid form. Which means that you might have to forgive us if some of the technicalities don't work quite as we hope they will. Hopefully everything will run smoothly. Richard, Anna, Manuel and others have done a sterling job in bringing us to this point, but if things do go wrong, do bear with us. Talking about things going wrong and the unexpected happening, in a certain sense, the challenges that we've been through over the past 18 months and beyond make the topic of tonight's lecture all the more pertinent. We are looking at a subject of kindness and compassion in leadership, and we're joined by two very eminent speakers, both of whom have published in this area, published books in this area no less. Our first speaker tonight will be Professor Michael West, Senior Visiting Fellow at the King's Fund, London, but also Professor here, Professor of Organisational Psychology at Lancaster. And we're also joined by Professor Mike Thomas, who is Chair of University Hospitals of Morecambe Bay NHS Foundation Trust. And both of them will, in their own way, explore what compassionate leadership is and what the key barriers are to it becoming more universally embraced. And I would like to give the floor, both virtually and physically, I'm pleased to say, to Professor Michael West, who will speak here.
Thank you, Andy. Hello, everybody. Hello. It's good to see you, and hello to the people who are watching virtually. It is an enormous pleasure to be here this evening. I was saying to Andy earlier that this is only the third occasion that I've spoken face-to-face with real people in the last 20 months, and the second was yesterday, and it still feels like a gift. So it's genuinely a huge pleasure, and thank you very much, and also Anna and the team for enabling me to participate in this event. It has been, of course, tumultuous. It has been extraordinary. These are almost platitudes over the last 20 months. It's been a time of enormous tragedy. In our country, 110,000 additional lives have been lost during this period compared with the previous years, 5 years, on annualized accounting. It's been a time of huge fear for all of us. Back last April, I think all of us, a year ago April, all of us were afraid for our lives and the lives of our loved ones. And that's been true of humanity around the world. And these times of great difficulty in our lives are always times as well where there's an opportunity for learning. And I think it's really important for all of us to take the time to reflect and learn about what we've been through and to think about what it means for our lives as individual human beings going forward. What can we take from this that will help us to live more fulfilling, happier, more meaningful lives? And I think the same is true for our teams, our organizations, our societies, our country, and our leaders, and indeed for humanity as a whole. And I think the most significant lesson of this last 20 months has been the lesson of compassion. We've seen incredible selflessness from people. NHS staff in reality, back a year ago, April, were going into work every day, afraid that they would contract the virus and lose their lives. But still they went into work. And tragically, many of them did lose their lives. And they were afraid also of bringing the virus home to their families and infecting their families and losing their loved ones. But still they went into work. And the same was true not only of the NHS, but of key workers in many other industries, social care in particular, as well as other key workers like the people who collect our rubbish bins every week, and so many other people. In fact, what we saw was the most huge upwelling of compassion in society. Millions of people volunteered, formally and informally. Formally to help the NHS, to help with the vaccination program, informally to call in on their elderly neighbours living alone, just to find ways to help each other. People stayed at home. They didn't go and visit their loved ones. They didn't hug their loved ones. They protected the NHS. They saved lives. And that's typically what happens during human disasters. We see from Rebecca Solnit's magisterial work in her book called A Paradise Built in Hell, how typically in major disasters people behave with compassion. They help each other. Contrary to what political elites believe, which is that people will loot, they'll riot, they'll kill, they'll be selfish, the opposite happens in reality. Our government was convinced that people wouldn't go along with a lockdown, so they delayed the lockdown. So compassion, I think, is the most important lesson for us going forward. And what is it? What is this thing called compassion? Well, for me to be, if Anna here is in pain or distress, then for me to be compassionate, I have to do 4 things. I have to attend to you, understand, empathize, and help. And attending means giving my attention to you, being present with you here and now. Nancy Klein talks about listening with fascination. And then I have to understand the causes of your distress, ideally through having a dialogue with you rather than me imposing my understanding. And third, I have to have an empathic feeling response. I have to feel your pain, your distress, mirroring it without being overwhelmed by it, because that gives me then the motivation for the 4th critical element of compassion, which is helping you or serving you in some way. And we know a lot more now about the difference between empathy, mere empathy or sympathy alone, and compassion. So neuroscience studies over the last 20 years using functional magnetic resonance imaging show that when we ask people to be empathic towards somebody in pain, that's typically associated with the activation of various pain centers in the brain. Whereas when we ask somebody to have the intention to be compassionate, that's associated with the activation of reward centers in the brain. And the first makes sense because we're mirroring the other person's pain, so it has an impact in our brains. And the second makes sense too, because 99% of us have been hardwired by evolution to be compassionate towards others in pain or distress. Why? Because that impulse enables us to form social groups, families, communities, tribes, where we feel a sense of safety and belonging, where we can share resources, where we can protect ourselves from threat. Compassion is a way of blurring the boundaries between self and other, establishing a feeling of connection, a feeling of belonging. And belonging is probably, outside of our basic biological needs, the most important need we have as human beings. We're as likely to die from the effects of loneliness as we are from the effects of smoking, say. I had my new granddaughter come and visit at the weekend. She's 5 months old. It's about the 3rd time I've seen her. And she has these amazing eyes that lock onto my eyes. And the sense of belonging that's created in me by that is incredible. We're hardwired 99% of us, to be compassionate. We also know a lot more now about the role of compassion in healthcare, which I think is instructive in terms of our thinking about how we look after each other in our communities, in our lives, in our work organizations. So there has been a huge amount of research over the last 20 years or so into the role of compassion in healthcare, mostly randomized controlled trials, the kind of gold standard, if you like, of research methodologies in medicine, or using meta-analyses. That's where all of the data from the various published studies on a particular topic are combined, and then we do an analysis overall to tell us what the research overall is indicating to us. So just some brief examples. There are many, many more, but just selecting a few. The first is a very large randomized controlled trial of anaesthetists visiting patients prior to surgery, where they either do a normal pre-surgical visit and provide sedatives, or they do a normal visit without sedatives, but are extra compassionate in their interactions. And what we see is that the compassion intervention is associated with patients feeling calm but not drowsy, whereas the normal visit with sedatives, patients are drowsy but they don't feel emotionally calm. And post-surgically, those who receive the compassion visit have a much lower requirement for painkillers and a significantly shorter length of hospital stay, very important in the current circumstances we face. The second is 2 randomized controlled trials, one in Italy, one in the US, of patients with an early diagnosis of non-small cell lung cancer, which is treatments are unlikely to cure, assigned either to normal early cancer care or to normal early cancer care plus early palliative care, if you like, extra compassionate care. And it was a study of quality of life for patients, and in fact demonstrated that the palliative care condition was associated with a much better quality of life. But what was a complete surprise to the researchers was the finding that those patients also lived significantly longer. And we see similar large effects of clinician compassion in the treatment of long-term disorders like HIV and diabetes, and of therapist compassion in the treatment of mental health problems. And when we talk to clinicians, over 50% of them say, it's all very well, but we just don't have time to be compassionate in our work. And of course, given the pressures that health service staff currently face in our country, you can understand that. But the research evidence tells us that more compassion doesn't affect encounter length necessarily. Some of these interventions involved 20-second scripts that people had to read, had to memorize, and then use. I understand how difficult this must be for you. I want you to know I'm going to be with you all the way through this. But also what's significant and consistent with what I was saying about the neuroscience studies is that in randomized controlled trials where GPs, and another one where nurses are asked to be extra compassionate in their interactions with patients over a 14-day period, it has a significant impact on their own well-being, lower levels of anxiety and stress and depression. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but suffice to say that probably, the evidence we have is that compassion is the most important intervention we have in healthcare and social care. And the effect sizes are remarkable, greater than the effects of aspirin, commonly used in the treatment of heart attacks at the early stages, and greater than the effects of statins in the 5-year risk of a cardiovascular event. So the point I want to make is that compassion is so profoundly important in human behavior, as you can see. And so what we need to be thinking about is, how do we create the conditions in our families, in our communities, in our work organizations particularly, where people will treat those they provide care for with compassion, those they can provide services for with compassion, they'll treat each other with compassion, and actually they'll be compassionate towards themselves. And the answer to that question is, well, it's about the culture of the organization, the culture of our communities, the culture of our teams. And every interaction by every one of us every day is an opportunity for us to shape the culture of our work teams, our departments, our organizations, our communities. How warm we are, how kind we are, how irritable, how cynical, how compassionate we are. Every interaction shapes the cultures of our communities. But the role of formal leaders, we know, is particularly powerful. The last 100 years of research on organizational culture has told us that the most significant intervention in culture is what leaders do, what leaders pay attention to, what they talk about, what they focus on, what they measure, particularly what they portray in their own behavior, tells us what it is that's important to them. Therefore, what should be important to us? So we desperately need our leaders, I think, at every level, our political leaders, our organizational leaders, our leaders in communities to model compassion in their leadership. That means these four things. Leaders who are present with those they lead, who listen with fascination, who seek to understand the challenges that those they lead face, not by imposing some hierarchical understanding, some elevated hierarchical understanding, but through a dialogue. Leaders who have the emotional intelligence to empathize with those they lead, to feel the difficulties they feel, and leaders who then help those they lead. In work organizations, that means helping those they lead to do their jobs more effectively by helping to remove the obstacles that get in the way and helping to ensure they've got the resources they need, the right numbers of staff with the right skills, the right equipment, the right technology, the right training, and so on. Now, this is not some, new fancy model of leadership that's emerged from the pandemic. We've known for the last 60 or 70 years that these behaviors are the key behaviors that constitute effective leadership. Probably the research tells us in leadership the most important skill of any leader is listening, being present and listening deeply. And the most important task of a leader is helping those that they lead to do their jobs more effectively. Lots of other tasks, but that's probably the most important task. And we also know that these behaviors, it's no coincidence, they're the same behaviors that constitute compassion. Why? Because they're the behaviors that enable us to connect with each other, to feel a sense of trust, to feel a sense of belonging. And they're the behaviors that collectively predict, for example, organizational performance. We know from Ben Schneider's work, for example, among many others in the United States over a number of decades, that there's what he calls a value chain, that where staff in an organization, for example, retail sector, he studied in depth, where staff in retail organizations report their leaders generally behave in these four ways, that's associated with higher levels of staff satisfaction, better customer service, customer satisfaction, customer loyalty, company productivity and profitability, a value chain from these behaviors to the outcomes we seek. 18 years ago, I had the huge privilege of leading the design of a new national staff survey for the NHS and the initial implementation of it. That's run now for 18 years, and over 500,000 staff respond every year to that survey. It's provided us with the most enormous data set. We can do the most sophisticated statistical longitudinal modeling. And we see from the data exactly the same value chain, that where staff in NHS trusts report that their leaders generally behave in these ways, that's associated subsequently with higher levels of staff satisfaction, higher levels of staff engagement. That in turn predicts patient satisfaction and care quality as rated by the independent audit body Care Quality Commission. Where staff in trusts generally report that their leaders don't behave in these ways, subsequently we see staff reporting higher levels of chronic work overload, higher levels of stress, higher work pressure associated with lower levels of patient satisfaction with the care they receive, and significantly worse care quality financial performance, and higher levels of avoidable patient mortality. So for all of these reasons, I think compassionate leadership is key to our future. We face a moment in human history where we must transform our communities and our cultures in our local areas and globally. But this is not, I want to be clear, some soft cushion scented candles approach to leadership. On the contrary, I think it requires much more courage and authenticity than the rather easy opt-out of command and control leadership. We just tell people what to do. Because compassion, as I've said, is a core response from us as human beings. So it's not some new skill to learn. It's about reclaiming part of who we are, which has got out of balance with our other emotional regulation systems, dealing with threat and resource acquisition. The nurturing emotional regulation system has become imbalanced, I think, in a variety of ways, and we see lots of evidence of that. There were 93,000 calls, 999 calls last year in this country for people with mental health problems. Compassion is a way of being, not another skill to learn. It's a way of being. It's letting go of effort and being present with the other and seeking to understand and empathize and help. So compassionate leadership is about being effective as leaders, ensuring direction, alignment, and commitment. And if leadership is not inclusive, then by definition it's not compassionate. Because inclusion and compassion, they're like two sides of the same hand, and the hand is the hand of belonging. You know, inclusion and discrimination are moral issues, of course, but they're also health issues. If a little girl is excluded from her friendship group in the playground, it has an effect of inflammation in her central nervous system with health consequences. People who are subjected to discrimination over their lifespan, people with disabilities, people from minority ethnic groups, experience a biological weathering effect over the lifespan, which results in health inequalities and early mortality. And inclusion is also a performance issue. We know that diverse teams and boards and executive teams and primary healthcare teams are, when they have direction, alignment and commitment and value difference, are much more productive and innovative. Why? Because they have a greater wealth of knowledge and skills and experience to draw upon to help with decision-making and innovation. So it's a moral issue, a health issue, a performance issue. And it's also, compassionate leadership is not about increasing my power by being, a compassionate leader. It's about enabling everybody to feel they have leadership responsibility and accountability. In our communities, in our organizations, everybody has voice and a feeling of belonging and a sense of contribution. And we know, I do a lot of my work in the NHS. It's probably the largest, most skilled and most motivated workforce in the whole of industry, yet we continue to manage them through command and control. It's absurd. The most effective organizations in the world generally have no more than 3 or 4 reporting levels. In the typical NHS trust, reporting levels are usually in double figures. And for every reporting level we add about 10% to bureaucracy. So it's about, for the future, we must think about moving forward with compassionate and collective leadership where everybody feels a sense of responsibility for contributing. And it's about how we work across boundaries compassionately with other teams, other departments, other organizations, other community groups, other voluntary groups, other nations, in the way we work together. Despite the disappointments of COP26, most of the nations in the world were together trying to solve a shared problem. And key to compassionate leadership is the topic of self-compassion, which I cover in the book that Andy referred to, that was a privilege for me, a labor of love for me during the course of the pandemic, having the time and space to bring together research evidence, practical resources, case studies, And the book finishes on the topic of self-compassion, because if we're to be compassionate in our leadership, then we must first be self-compassionate. And I know many people recoil from that and say, well, I'm here to be helpful to others, not looking after myself. But actually, that's the basis for our ability to be compassionate towards others. Learning about things like how we recover from work. Sabine Sonnentag at the University of Mannheim has studied this for the last 20 years, and her research shows that we recover from work when we do stuff in the evenings and weekends that give us a feeling of psychological detachment. Activities like, I don't know, reading a good book or watching a Netflix series, of engaging in tasks that give us a sense of achievement, like cooking a nice meal, making sure we have enough work breaks, practicing meditation, physical exercise, all these things we know. And we know that that spending time in nature, Mike and I were just talking about, is profoundly important for our well-being, extraordinarily so, with a hierarchy of effects, from blue spaces being most powerful, the sea, rivers, lakes, closely followed by green spaces, a trough of Bowland, and then a little way down, urban green spaces, and then just being outside at all under the sky is good for us. And there's an inverse recovery law that Sabina's work has showed, that those who most need to engage in these activities are least likely to do so. It's also about what we know from research about the 6 ways to well-being. By far the most important is spending quality time with the people we love and who love us. That need to belong being fulfilled. And getting enough sleep, a little way down, is important. 7.5 to 8 hours sleep is necessary for 99% of us. There's no cheating nature. But self-compassion is ultimately about having the courage as a way of being to be self-aware in the moment, to know when I'm feeling angry, anxious, afraid, ashamed, hurt, and to accept those feelings so that we can then inquire into, rather than berating ourselves for feeling negative feelings, that we accept them, rather than repressing them, denying them. And then we can inquire into them and bring a nurturing attitude towards ourselves, a loving attitude towards ourselves. After all, each of us is as deserving of love as every other human being on the planet. Almost as it were, metaphorically hugging ourselves. I had a paper sent to me this week from Communication in Psychoneuroendocrinology, showing that when people got hugs, having had a very stressful experience, their cortisol levels came down, their heart rates came down. But the really interesting manipulation was, in this study, they got people to hug themselves for 10 or 15 seconds instead of having a hug from somebody else. Cortisol levels came down, heart rate came down. We must look after ourselves. And when we connect deeply with ourselves through being self-compassionate, it enables us to clear away some of the flotsam and jetsam that gets in the way of our relationships with others, and connect more deeply with ourselves and with the core values that give our lives meaning, like courage and wisdom and compassion. And that enables us then to connect more deeply with all of those that we work with, we lead, we provide care for, all of those we interact with in our lives. So compassionate leadership, founded in self-compassion, is key to our futures. And now is the moment. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Very powerfully you have spoken and led us through the topic, and we've got questions coming up later, but our next speaker is Professor Mike Thomas, and so Mike, let me invite you to take the stand and share what you have to say about compassionate leadership.
That's a hard act to follow, Michael. Thank you. Thank you very much. I write about compassion and kindness. I've done research on it for about 15 years now. And people often say to me, oh, tell us about kindness and tell us about compassion. And I have to explain, actually, my research is, I'm interested in what stops people being kind, what stops people being compassionate. So when people go, oh, Mike Thomas, he's up there, he's doing a lot of work on compassion, I have to explain, actually, what I'm interested in is what stops people being compassionate, particularly in organisations and particularly in leadership. And, you know, as Michael says, there is enough evidence now. It's been going on over easily 70 years now. Plenty of evidence to show that compassionate and kind leadership actually improves productivity, improves output, improves well-being and engagement. And yet, it's still not a widespread practice. And that's what I'm interested in. And there was a lovely, lovely word that Michael said there when he was explaining the sense of compassionate leadership, that it's absurd that people don't do it. And that is a really, really interesting word, because I think what happens in a lot of organisations, it becomes the reality that people see and work every day. And it's only when you're new to it, or you're on the outside looking in, or you want to find the opposite, that the absurd becomes evident. It's like the French theatre of the absurd. It's funny because the audience realise that the players in the play are treating it very seriously. But for the observer, it's clearly absurd that people engage in this. And yet, since the Industrial Revolution, we have done. So I want to look at really, well, what stops people being compassionate? Because as Mike says, you know, we have mirror genes, we have mimic genes, we have neuro-linguistic programming when we're very young, Chomsky's work, etc. We like, as human beings, to predict how other human beings behave. And one way of doing that is to copy the behavior when we're infants and then learn the facial language. So it gets really interesting. Why then, when we form organizations, we turn away from that almost instinctive or genetic predisposition to be herd-like and understanding. Some interesting studies, these are a mix of studies. Impact of the pandemic on leadership approaches. Well, funny enough, there's been decreased stress around work because people have been working from home, which is an interesting thing to think about. People feel less anxious about their work. There's been obviously an increased use of the virtual world. Everybody does Teams now on Zoom. It's just almost secondary. We've gone beyond, we'd have all gone through those jokes where people got up and they were inappropriately dressed or left their microphones on and said inappropriate things, and lots of things went on the World Wide Web of people doing silly things. We've learned that there is even a code of behavior around the way we behave on Teams. But not everyone, of course. If you take the NHS, clinicians haven't been able to work from home. You know, for many people involved in manual labour, for many people involved in, I call it hard FM, but it would be like estates and things like that. If you're an electrician, if you're a plumber, you have to go out and do things. The luxury of just working at home doesn't exist for everyone. But those that have been working at home have showed a raised awareness of what work means to them as a human being. So there's been a huge upsurge in the sense of purpose at work, or perhaps the lack of sense of purpose about work. And some industries have seen huge movements of people moving out. The hotel trade, hostelry in general, for instance, some areas of farming, particularly fruit or poultry, have had real difficulty in getting people to come back. And part of that is people saying, well, it just doesn't give me that sense of purpose anymore. I've found other things and better things that I could do. There was also a huge increase in unsociable hours of time in work and on work. Teams working is actually worse. Many of us, I'm looking around, many of us would have had, here's your diary, back to back to back to back to back. Oh, and you don't have to travel, so you can see someone at 6 o'clock, and perhaps we can carry on the meeting at 7. And that's supported by the research. Though there has not been an increase in outcomes, been an increase in outputs, but productivity hasn't really gone up. So there have been a lot more hours and a lot of meetings and a lot of people in meetings, but not much has come of it. Not really. And a decreased disengagement. Believe it or not, people feel more engaged with their employment and their organisation if they're working online than if they're physically there, for most people. There is a caveat to this. This is age-related. The older you are, the more likely you would have experienced this. If you're under 40, you wouldn't have done that. If you're under 40, you would have increased your stress and anxiety in teens. Younger people, particularly those under 25, found team working very, very difficult. And there's lots of research going on into that at the moment. One could be, and I'm very interested in this, it fits in with what you're saying, Michael, because young people who have been born and raised in the internet world, there is some evidence to show that they have not learnt the subtleties of mimicking facial expressions and body language as children. And now they're young adults and they're engaged in observing people's language on a very snapshot, on a physical encounter. They can cope, but when it's just a shoulder up and it's just a face and it's not supported by the rest of the body, they struggle. They struggle to read how people's facial expressions indicate whether they can predict what people are going to do, say, or think. Which is an interesting phenomenon. I'll digress for a second. Children born in the internet age show an increased thinking compared to those of us who were born before the internet age. It doesn't mean anything at the moment. It does mean when they're older, they will probably have a higher awareness of stress and anxiety in their 30s, whereas those who were born before the internet age would experience that level of stress and anxiety in their 50s. So you could predict, perhaps, when you look at some of the neurological work going on in America, that as children who are born today, our population will become more anxious as they get older, but they will be more anxious at a much younger age than those who are used to more physical human interaction. And that sense of time increases. It's mini microseconds. But you can see it when they sell a phone and they go, this phone can connect you 1 second faster than this phone. And people queue up. People queue up because that sense of time is much, much more experienced for younger age groups than older age groups. So the idea of queuing, the idea of patience is a burden. Whereas older people are more aware of that due to socialization. But it is something to think about when you think about compassion and you talk to groups of different age groups. And for those of you in academia, it becomes particularly pertinent when you're talking to people who are 18. This is the digital age, I think. I think Michael West speaks a lot of sense. He's written a book, he's researched. 18 years, as you say, we've used the staff survey in the NHS, tons of data. You couldn't think of someone with a better track record. And he's talking about compassionate leadership. And yet, we still don't have it as a widespread practice. And there's plenty of evidence to show that those organisations who don't engage in compassionate leadership aren't very good. Even though you can read the Financial Times, and you can read The Economist, and you can get experts who come out on media, and they'll tell you about large companies and monopolies, etc. But dig down into the data, it gets really, really interesting. The S&P 500, which is equivalent in the USA of our FT 100, only 10% of those in the top 500 in 1983 were still there in 2013. 10%. So 90% of the companies have disappeared over that period. So the idea that you can have a large company with hierarchical management and it survives generations is really a myth. 82% of organisations experience change over an average 3-year period. BAE, slightly different. BAE have 40-year business plans. But most organisations, all of us in this room, would have experienced, right, you're now a leader, you're now a manager. Okay, first thing, get a vision, get a purpose, have a strategy, talk about your values. How long do you want a strategy for? 10 years. Nobody says, how absurd is that? 11 years ago, we were coming out of the global crash, 2018 to 2010, 2008, sorry, to 2010. They looked at the companies that survived that crash in America. They found that those who survived the crash had 3 things in common. The first was they didn't cut their marketing budget. They kept telling the public they were there. So when the public started to recover and they were ready to spend again, they knew that this company had these products. Second, and important while we're in a university setting, they never cut their R&D. Usually large companies go cut R&D first. It's one of the soft targets for cutbacks, but they didn't. So they had new innovations, new products, new designs. Thirdly, none of them had a charismatic or heroic leader. They had modest people who worked for the organisation, sometimes in family firms, who believed, as Michael was saying, in sharing, in distributing the leadership. They were very modest people. So the idea of, follow me, I'm an industrial leader, is another myth. I could give you the American Psychological Association study, which indicated 33% of heroic leaders also scored highly on personality disorder charts. Or I could give you a study on the House of Commons, which showed that the majority of MPs come from broken homes. So there are things that we could unpick when you look at these myths. And only 23% of companies are actually successful over a defined period of time. Interesting. They never look at the university sector on these things, of course. There are some great examples of success. Has it changed workplace expectations the last 2 years? Very quickly, very fast. Hand on heart, how many of you in this room, in your work life, in the last 5 years, have had a discussion at work that says, do you think we should go online? And somebody somewhere's gone, you can't do it. You can't do it. We use Blackboard and we've got all these softwares and we have licenses and you have to download. Well, the pandemic happened and it happened. It happened across the world. It's that absurdity again. It's like the last 10 years of cuts in public service, which was absurd, but it comes down to choice. Despite the rationale that was put forward, we chose not to change. And then the panic came, the pandemic came, and we had to change. And so health and well-being is now very high on most young people's agenda when they apply for a job. They don't want to do lots of nights. They don't want to do strange shifts. They don't want to do odd hours. They don't want 0 contracts. They want something that will make them feel well. They want to be diverse and inclusive. They want to be alongside colleagues from different backgrounds, different orientations. They feel that gives them this sense of purpose. And it feeds in again with what Michael says. Purposefulness at work actually makes you healthier, makes you live longer, helps you recover from any illnesses that you might get much faster. Those people who lack purpose have higher levels, as you'd imagine, of stress and depression, sleeplessness. That sense of you getting up and you're doing something. And I could say this to all of you in this room, hopefully when you're in your dotage, in your 90s perhaps, over 100 maybe, and you're sitting there with slippers, maybe you're drinking alcohol or eating meat, and will you look back at your life and say, I had a defined sense of purpose. I did something that had some meaning. And I say this to medical students and nursing students. If you hold the hand of someone in pain, that's worth that glass of wine. If you help someone die peacefully and help their relative deal with their grief, that's worth that glass of wine. If you change someone's life so they cope with grief, illness, diseases, the fear, the anxiety, the interventions that are required, that's worth it. And I don't drink alcohol, but I would buy you a glass of wine. But imagine if you lived a life that had no purpose. You retired and you went, well, yeah, just did it, really. How anxiety-provoking in an old life is regret. That's what young people are seeking now. They're seeking a purpose in their life, so as they age, they have less regret. Hence, the environment movement, the green movement. And this sense of fairness, transparent fairness, and teamwork. It's shown that people don't want lots of stars, they just like lots of good team colleges. Career structures. People laughed at Aldi when it first came and started breaking into the market of grocery. But they were very, very clever. Because what Aldi did was they approached graduates and new graduates and offered them one of the best management courses that you could get into retail. A young person could then feel that they were doing something quite important and got a good salary. And they got some of the best brains in there. And you can see some of the results already. And flexible working. People don't want to do 9 till 5 anymore. They don't want to sit on the motorway for an hour each side of the day. You know, they don't want to work somewhere for 20 years and say, actually about 4 months of that was just sitting in the car. So people have changed quickly in 2 years. And as Michael said, you know, lots of things there about how to apply it. And yet people fail these simple tests. You know, I observe people, I watch people. People talk about being compassionate. In the NHS, as you say, Michael, they talk a lot about being compassionate and caring. And I see a lot of it. I absolutely do. And it's humbling. It really is. But I also watch leaders who say, yeah, I think we should do this. And then they behave in a way that's opposite. They say be kind, and then they don't give people time because they're busy. They say, I really believe that we should be in a diverse workplace, and I think we should have more BME inclusivity in the workplace, but I'm too busy to actually attend any of the meetings that could get these things off the ground. And that sense of being inauthentic or unfair. Remember, everybody clapped for the NHS, and then when it was over, it's not over, but when that bit of it was over, the government said, yeah, we're not giving you a pay rise. That was lovely. How consistent is that? Go out and bang a pan with a wooden spoon, but we won't pay the people who do that. That went down really badly because it was felt that the government was inauthentic and not genuine. And as Michael says, leadership is presence. It's not good enough to say, I won't be somewhere. Just being there, even if you don't say anything, is leadership. I worked with a vice-chancellor who's really good, and he said to me once, doesn't matter what happened, Mike, doesn't matter what goes on at work, how bad it is, when I walk out of that office, I walk around the university smiling, because I don't know who's watching me, and I don't know if they go, oh my God, the vice-chancellor looks sad today or miserable today, and people go, I'm going to lose our jobs. So he went out there and smiled, he made it his thing. Leadership, as Michael says, it's both in place and of place. You can be a leader of a place. You can be a leader of people, but you can be a leader in place. Trade unionists, they're really good leaders. They don't often have a hierarchical management role, but they can be fantastic leaders. consultants, clinical teams, deans, heads of departments, professors. I once tried to do a survey, actually when I worked with Anne at Chester, and we looked at what was leadership and how did people feel about leadership. We had to give it up in academic life because everybody kept on coming back going, depends who you mean. You know, my head of department is my leader on this bit, but I'm doing some research, so the PI's my lead on this, or the prof's my lead on this, but then it could be the dean, it might be the pro-vice chancellor. We just gave up in the end. We just came to the conclusion that academia was a bit like a village. You know, people had roles in it and responsibilities, and sometimes it was quite fluid, and that idea of an industrial hierarchical thing was doomed to failure, though they keep trying to introduce it in academic life, which is absurd, amusingly absurd. And like Michael says, if you don't look after yourself, then what are you saying to other people? Look at me, I'm working, burning both candles at both ends, my eyes are red, I'm losing weight, I'm too tired to concentrate, but look at the role model I give. How many of us in this room really seriously have had urgent emails, and when you've looked at it, it's like, well, the photocopy is gone, the printer doesn't work. It's not urgent. Urgent's when you've got an arterial bleed, or your family's in A&E. That's urgent. Or perhaps the Vice-Chancellor, you get a phone call from the Secretary saying, this needs to be done today. But there is a way of being calm and thoughtful, which is part of presence and part of kindness, I would argue. And that means caring for yourself. And being inclusive, influential. And the last one, it's not Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not the new currency. Time is the new currency for people in organizations. Time is really the currency. Time to think, to reflect. Those of you engaged in research, you'll know very well that when you're shopping at Tesco's, you're not really shopping at Tesco's. You're trying to work out what the next thing you're going to work on, or how this puzzle fits in with that, or what you should say in your paper. That's still research in my head. Still engagement. And it's time spent on research. And all of you will know, all of us will know, if you love doing something, what's the best thing of upsetting someone? Just reduce the time that they can do it in. That's what young people really, really value now. The time to have a purpose. And as Michael said at the end, it's not a soft option. See, it's easier to be hierarchical. I speak as ex-forces. I was submariner for 5 years. It is easier to be hierarchical. Any of you engaged in medical practice will know that. It's much easier. It's much, much more skillful and much, much more imaginative and much, much more creative to be just and fair and kind. And being just and fair and authentic means having difficult conversations. I could give you examples of studies that I've done. 30% of staff taken to HR often say this is the first time it's ever been pointed out to me when they're in a formal system. You're not aware of it. 70% of people accused of bullying say they're not aware that they were bullied. I was once given an opportunity to observe a staff survey, and somebody had written in the staff survey, I have shared my office with Peter for 10 years and I hate him. And I often thought, I wonder if Peter knows. I wonder if they were Peter, anyway. So, difficult, it's fair and it's just, and staff know this, that when they're working with someone who isn't working well, for whatever reason, it's fair and just to have a difficult conversation, to call that individual in, and sometimes have an exit route for them. It's more unjust and more unfair, and staff are fully aware of this, to work alongside someone who gets away with things, who doesn't pull their weight, who never seems to get picked up for things, who's haphazard, half-hearted, demoralising. Study done by Woods in Australia on clinical wards. They trained actors to go in and be miserable. And they tried to measure the effect on morale of ward staff. And it took 14 minutes for the first impact on low morale to hit when somebody went into a place and acted miserably or acted against their values. 14 minutes. When they took the actors out, it took 6 months to rebuild the morale. So it happens very quickly. So it is unfair when staff see people who are not good co-workers and nothing is done about it. Policies and procedures, they can be seen as unjust and unfair, particularly if they're used inconsistently. Remuneration and reward happens all the time. Why do they get better pay? There's an exercise I used to give when I worked with the Oxford team. 3 people come to you and they say, we've got this idea, and you've got the money for one of them. Doesn't matter what you do, you have your design, you have a framework, same score. It doesn't matter what you do, it's the same score. And in the end, you have to decide it's one of them. There's no difference. The objective of the exercise is not to say, how did you reach that decision? The objective of the exercise is, how do you keep the other 2 still engaged? And that's the difficulty of kindness management. That when you're being seen to be consistent and you're giving out remuneration and reward, how do you keep those others who are not in that loop engaged? And give them development opportunities and resource allocation and workload. This is bread and beer to academics. Allocations of workloads. But it's that last word it all leads to. This breaks down. I worked in marriage guidance counselling for many years, actually, and then Relate. And because I'd done bereavement work and grief work, for some reason they always gave me couples that were going through a divorce. So I had to work with those couples in Liverpool. And the hardest thing I found in relationships at that level was if there was a breakdown in trust, the amount of courage it required to rebuild trust in a relationship. And the amount of time it took. So it breaks very quickly. It's the same in organisations. So you have to have time. You've got to give time. If you're a leader, you must diary time. It's just the currency. If you say to somebody, I haven't got time, you're basically saying you're of less value to me than someone I am giving my time to. It's not civil. And it decreases people's engagement with the work by 48%. Nearly half of the output when you say, I haven't got time to see you. And resources, and learning and leadership, all the things Michael was saying. There should be programs that says this is what you have to be in this new world now. And development, career pathways. People that have emotional intelligence, just as important as their technical skills. And put stress on compassionate and kind leadership when you recruit. I hardly ever see it in job descriptions. Hardly ever. It doesn't say it's an essential skill. It's interesting. I like this. This is what Alan Hughes said in a conference I was in. Most organisations can be well managed. It's common sense, engineering techniques. But they can be outstanding if they're well led. And the difference, really genuinely the difference, supported by research, all the work that you're doing, Michael, suggests that that's it. So I'll end with something similar to you, really. We are observers in the theatre of the absurd unless we start to engage with the actors and say, you've got to stop. There are better ways of doing this. Because I think sometimes when people are in the organisation, they really can't see the wood for the trees. They have to just stop, be taken out of the organisation, or perhaps just go somewhere where they have a different way of looking at it. Thank you.
this point, we need to draw the evening to a conclusion. A couple of things before I invite us all to thank our two fascinating speakers. One is to tell you about the next lecture in the series, which is going to be on the 20th of January. It's a Zoom talk entitled, "To What Extent is the Human Species Slowing Down?" Professor Danny Dorling from Oxford University will speak to that, talking about technological advances, birth rate changes, everything in our lives, and how that's affecting us. If you want even more, then there is a mailing list, and there is a website that you can look at and find out more of these events and fill your diary with them. We're also absolutely keen to hear what you've made of it, hearing your views, what could we be doing better, and you will be, if you registered for this, you will be sent a survey in the next few days, and we'd love to hear what you thought about it, and there's even an incentive to do so. You may win a £20 voucher. So there you go. If you're online, you may even get a poll right now, and we're very grateful for your feedback. But all it then remains to do is two things. One is that immediately after this, there is a wine reception just outside, to which those of you in the room are very warmly invited. Those online, you better get cracking if you want to get there. But really, the significance of this evening has been made by our two speakers who've, well, held us wrapped, I would say. Both personally, you've given lots of challenging exhortations to me and to think through my leadership accordingly. But I think for all of us, you've illuminated a very interesting subject which could be transformational for all of us. Thank you very much. Please join with me.